What we're just going to start out is first off, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about what you do. I'm really excited. This is one of my favorite topics, favorite challenges. I really hope to incorporate it in my own work. Before I get onto that kind of soapbox, tell me a little bit about yourself, name, what you do, and then we're going to kind of dive into your personal history as well.
Okay, so my name is Valerie Cartonio, and I am the producer and host of the Prison Pod podcast, which is a podcast for people who are in prison. And the mission of that is to save lives, restore hope, reduce suffering, and recidivism.
So I want to clarify, people know this. It is a podcast that is specifically available in prisons, right?
Yes, and it's also available to friends and family on top of that, and it's on YouTube too.
So how in the world do you wake up one morning and you're like, you know what, I'm going to do a podcast that is broadcast to prisons specifically? Like, I know you have an array of experiences, and I want to touch on all of them, but you pick a starting point as to how this project came to be yours.
Okay, so I was in a master's program at the University of Maine here in Orono, and I was very fortunate to be on a ground level project that they have started. In place of doing a thesis, we were allowed to do a project. So originally, my project was designed to teach a course on sociology and peace studies in the prisons, and COVID happened. So they closed down all the jails and prisons and nobody could go in. So I couldn't do a pilot program to have a study done for my master's project. So I was talking to my advisor, who happened to be in Indonesia at the time, and we were meeting via Zoom, which was really quite interesting. And he knew that I had done radio. And he said, well, how about a podcast? And I says, but I don't know how to do a podcast. And he says, well, you could learn, right? So I had 6 months to come up with finding out how to do a podcast and the equipment and the whole works and plan a podcast because I didn't really know. I did do radio, so I had experience doing interviews.
And tell me a little bit what the original study was going to be before COVID kind of wiped that out.
So my bachelor's degree was in sociology with a concentration of crime, law, and justice. So I had been working in the facilities for about 20 years. So I was also very interested in Eastern philosophies and Buddhist studies. So I looked into peace studies, and that I had a minor in that. So when I looked into doing my master's, the interdisciplinary program had a concentration in peace studies. So I took the peace studies in sociology, and of course, sociology is the study of how we tick, what makes us do what we do, our backgrounds, and all the things in life that affect who we become. So whether or not we're raised in church or in a poor neighborhood or a rich neighborhood, what our educational level is, what our parents' educational level is, our culture, all of those things come into play. So when you look at all of those, that's what makes us who we are. Those are the things that we develop as a child going into adulthood. So if we have the right guidelines, we have a better chance. If we have those things that we need in life, the nurturing and our basic needs met, it really makes a big difference. And then when you take peace studies fit in perfectly because so much of peace studies is on forgiveness. And a lot of peace and reconciliation studies have come around to working in the prisons and trying to bring the two people from both sides together to be able to have a better understanding of each other and try to find some type of forgiveness or a way to continue in life peacefully rather than suffering through the event or the crime that happened.
Right. I don't remember if we touched on this when we first spoke, but what you're describing is restorative justice, at least the practice of
Exactly.
in certain. So, do you find that you're still doing a lot of work in that regard with the same goal in mind as restorative justice?
Yes, actually, I'm now involved with a group that is being held out of the Maine State Prison. There's some residents there that have a monthly meeting called the Awakening Exchange, and that is all about restorative justice and how it's actually being used in the facilities to help restore a lot of. Most people in prison have already suffered trauma themselves before they ever land in prison. So if that trauma is never addressed, the healing can never really happen. So if we want healthy people coming home, that's what we need to do. So this group talks about restorative practices and how to de-escalate when you find yourself getting wound up about a situation, how to bring mindfulness in, how to stay in the moment, and to do the countdown. You know, if you start getting wound up, just, okay, take a deep breath and count down from 10. Those little things are new habits and new ways that we can bring into our lives to help us deal with a conflict that's going on.
This is just a little side tangent, and it's ironic to me personally that the cues and the practices that you're mentioning right now are also in the classrooms with human services professionals as well. Like it's not clickbait, but it is so much as like everybody is now learning inside the prison system and outside how to use these techniques, right? So it's like everyone's getting a wave of chill out and do some mindfulness stuff. And it's cool to see it there.
Well, and it's, that quick reaction when you're used to being on the street or if you have PTSD, the first reaction is either fight or flight. And
Hmm.
you need to know maybe which one you need to do and take a second, you know.
Yeah.
That whole thing about taking a second, just all right, don't react, and that's so hard to learn. It really is when your first reaction is to punch somebody.
Right, exactly. I think the fight or flight thing is even almost like a nomenclature and doesn't actually describe like there's fight or flight are both reactions. And what people are learning how to do in these cases is to respond. But you have to like stop and give yourself the space to do that. And I'm sure that there's a plethora of people in, the prison system that benefit from that. And I'm assuming that also victims or survivors of crimes also benefit from those kinds of focuses within restorative justice, right?
Yes, and there's going to be victims that are never going to want to participate in something like that. And even in those circumstances, the offender can, I don't like that term, but they can write a letter just like they
Mhm.
were going to send it to them. So at least they can still express their thoughts, feelings, and emotions about what happened. And they can even see it through their own, when they read the letter back to themselves, they can see where their own changes have already happened.
Right, yeah. And, to respect the autonomy of anybody and their own free will. They don't have to. If they don't want to forget someone, they don't have to. But to go back to a point you made about when you were doing peace studies and how it centers on forgiveness. That's powerful and for sure. And so jumping back to the podcast, what was there an incident or set of incidents that were kind of invited you to, other than it being a school project? I realized you were kind of set up in regards to completing this journey one way or another. But how did you, I guess, end up in working with the prison system? Like why this population? Why this challenge and this social issue for you?
Well, it goes back a long ways. Back in 1997, I was doing radio, and I had my own radio show. Plus, I was substituting for somebody who was doing a Native American radio show. I knew the person and I knew the music, and they needed to take a sabbatical, so I filled in. And part of that was covering current issues that were going on. And there was a lot in the news at the time about a political prisoner named Lennon Peltier. And I was doing like updates and little news pieces about him. So, to make a long story short, I started getting letters from a couple of correctional facilities. One was from the kitchen at Cumberland County Jail, and one was from the laundry room at Maine Correctional Center. And they said, "We're listening to you on the radio, and while we're working at the jail, and can you play so and so?" You know, they'd request a song by someone, or "We really love this topic. Can you cover more?" So this all came into them writing and saying, "Can you do something to help us?" And I'm like, "Well, what can I do to help people in prison?"
Mm.
And they said, "Well, just do it on the radio. You know, let us write to you and ask you questions." So that's what I did for a while. And then I decided to do volunteer training. And one of my listeners knew I was going to do it. And he said, calls up. He had a real thick Southern drawl, real deep voice. "Yeah, I'd be interested in like helping you if you want." So my husband and I met him and his wife, and we hit it right off. And Rick says, "I'll do the volunteer training with you and go into the prisons with you." And it's really funny because Rick was a big guy at the time. He big, heavy guy, long hair with a ponytail and big beard. And my husband says, "I feel real safe with you going into the prisons with him." And so we started going in and doing volunteer work. And it started out really small, going in once a month and meeting with some of the people that were in there. And then we brought a drug and alcohol program in through White Bison, which is similar to an AA program, but geared for Native Americans. And we ended up bringing that into both the men and women's facility there. So I kind of just started doing volunteer work. I always wanted to work in corrections, youth corrections, when I was young. But at the time, women just weren't doing that work.
Yeah, so you stepped into it quite gracefully, and then it just kind of progressed quickly after that. You go from the radio to working and then volunteering and being trained as a volunteer, and then I guess everything just kind of, you know, exacerbated after that fact, which is great. So it wasn't like you woke up one day and like, yeah, I'm gonna go do that. I'm gonna go work as a, a radio broadcaster, as a DJ in the system. Okay, great. That's great. So, and it wasn't like you were actually like in the system itself and you came out, you're like, I'm going to do a radio for all my friends I'm leaving back there. You're just, it was a very natural progression for you, right?
Yeah. And the thing is as time goes on, I mean, when you first go in working in a prison facility, especially as a woman, the first thing is fear. I mean, you have fear, and it's the first facility we went to was an older facility that still had bars. So it was the clanging and the smells and the dankness and the darkness and the dirtiness. And it's just, you don't forget it. You do not forget it. So you can only imagine what it does to the people that live there. And over time, it's meant to desensitize you in all ways. Everything smells the same, everyone looks the same food over and over again. So I know it's another subject I got onto, but
No, we're definitely going to revisit that. I want to know, I want us to explore more into the living scenarios that you've witnessed and we know about and that you're advocating against. But just to jump back real quick, I'm curious about what the access to a podcast inside of a prison. Like, I think a lot of people like myself probably have assumptions about what prisoners do on a daily basis, what they're allowed to have. In some regards, nowadays, like, we do see a lot of cell phone footage coming out of prison systems. People think like, contraband is huge and fairly obvious, but not much is done about it. So we know that there's ways that people inside of prisons get access, but How is it that prisoners have access to a podcast or any of these outside resources similar to yours?
Okay, so in many facilities across the country, I don't know that all of them have it because it's fairly new. They have educational tablets that have preloaded programming into it. So they don't have access to the internet. And they have a text messaging service, but it's not the same as email. So everything is monitored through the facilities. So it's not like they can just email anybody. You have to be on a list and
Yeah,
do it that way. But um, so what happened with me is I was meeting with this group out of the prison, and I was talking to them, telling them about the tablet. Telling them about the podcast, and they said, "Oh, well, I'm going to tell the warden." And the warden got a hold of me, or I got a hold of him. And Edovo, which was the platform that had the tablets in the service, got a hold of me 8 weeks after I started my first podcast and said, "We want it on the tablets." So I was like, really? And I thought it was just going to be in Maine. So it was in Maine for about 6 weeks, and then they added it to the whole country. So
that's pretty badass. What I'm gonna
I
say
was
for
pretty excited.
yeah, for sitting down only like less than a year ago now, or maybe just a little over,
A little
and
over a
now
year, yeah.
it's yeah, that's really cool. That's really cool. So what you're describing is a prisoner from the inside advocating for themselves in a way. It's just like they go to the
Yes.
warden. The warden's the kind of the end all be all, and you say like, you know, here's something I feel like we need as prisoners. Can you help us out? And then, is it safe to assume like not all wardens are going to be open to this idea, but there's some wardens that are and like will do stuff for prisoners like that on their regard.
I will say something right now that Maine is being recognized for being very progressive right now in the way that they're doing things. Um, in the last 5 to 8 years, I'd say they've just turned full circle on how they're looking more at restorative practices than punitive. Um, they're looking at, I don't want to say a reward system, but it is a reward system. When people have gone 6, 8 years with good behavior, why not give them something else to look forward to? And so here in Maine, they've been really pushing education. So the two men that I've been in contact with, one of them just got accepted into a PhD program, and the other one is teaching at Colby College from the prison. So that's unheard of.
That's really cool though. Like and I know there's somebody out there probably not even listening to this podcast, but like somebody out there would hear me get excited about a prisoner teaching inside of a college and be like, "What are you excited about that for?" I'm excited because it's a reflection of us backing away from that punitive system, right? The idea you mentioned at the very beginning was we want to, when people come home from prison, we want them to be educated and prepared. At least that was the idea behind the system in the first place. And I feel like the social assumption, even now, even though we don't play off that field, is the same. People go to prison for punishment, they come out to start over, to have a second chance. Like, but that's not how it functions, is it?
No, it isn't at all. And that's the thing is, anyone who comes home with a felony, they never stop doing their time because every time that shows up, it keeps them from some places they can't even get food stamps. How do you come out of prison and not be able to get a job, not be able to find a place to live? You can't feed yourself, and you're supposed to be coming back and being a fine, upstanding citizen.
It's it's so backwards. It's so illogical. I can't even call it backwards because that would presume that there's a linear set of thoughts here. It doesn't make sense. And I understand now we're going to dive into, I can tell we're diving into those topics of treatment, okay, and punitive systems. Then I also want to dive in a little bit too into how the podcast supports those efforts. But I also want your insight now on just the crap happening in these systems and these prison, these containers, these human containers, because it's what it feels like. How can we all sit at home listening to this, still working off the assumptions that either this system works or people come out with higher chances of success or they've had a coming to Jesus moment, like they've gonna be better people. Like, how is it that we're still functioning from that outdated peace of mind? And when it's obvious that people are being, things are made worse after people have already made a bad decision, right? If that's even the case, we won't even get into that part, whether they're guilty or not. But the situation already sucks, and then we're putting people through hell. Private companies are putting people through hell, and then sending them back out into the world like, good luck, hope you do well. Like, how are we still functioning from that thought process?
Well, this is one thing that I think people don't understand. 95%, 95% of all people in jail and prison are coming home. They're coming home. They're coming back to your neighborhood. They're going to be living in society among you. Okay. Of that 95%, the recidivism rate, and recidivism is somebody who's going back to jail, is 77%. So that right there tells us that the system is not working. And of that population, we have 1.4 million children growing up without their parent because they're in prison. So doesn't it make sense that while somebody is in prison, for us to give them an education so that they can come out and get a job with a living wage that can support themselves? The idea of cleaning their records, once you've done your time and you've finished your probation, that should be somehow, they're working on expunging records now. But
Yeah.
to have to go through your whole entire life, I mean, I have guys that have been out for 20 years and they still have a hard time if they have to go get a new job because they had a felony from 30 years ago.
When they were
You know,
someone completely different. They're
right.
they're they're not the
And
same people at all.
the other thing is, if we look at all the studies on the frontal lobe of the brain and the development of our brains, it is a proven, known fact that it takes like to 25 to 27 before that area of our brain completely develops. And that is the part of our brain that is common sense. So we make our
Yeah.
quick reactions from that area. So if that isn't even developed, and we have so many of these young men are going into prison at 16, 17, 18 years old. So they haven't even become men. And you cannot become a man in prison. It's impossible, you know. And of course, then you talk about arrested development, because what happens is they never really develop as they're supposed to into adulthood. They pretty much, it's kind of like with the drinking and drugs, you stay at that age that you picked up.
Yeah, it's I've seen that in some populations of people with a disability, or they get a disability, some injury or something that develops later in life and kind of stunts that growth where they're still growing and dealing with this bodily, damage or change, it being a
Hmm.
challenge or whatnot. But they're stuck in the mentality of who they were before this has happened, right?
Right.
Um, and you're right, like the numbers tell us a different story. And we could walk up to anyone on the street right now who we assume like doesn't have much knowledge, tell them this, and they'd probably be a little distraught. Like, what? 77% of those people are going to go back in.
Yeah.
And then someone is going to turn around and say, why should I care? So you tell me, I know I care. We know Casey cares a lot about this topic. You tell me, as a stranger, why should I care? Like, why does this matter to me?
Well, if you don't care about the people, you probably care about how many taxes you're paying. And right now, it averages $40,000 to $45,000 a year to house somebody in prison. Now, I don't know about you, but I think $45,000 a year is a lot of money. And then you multiply that by millions that are in prison. I don't know exactly. I think it's 2.1 million that are in prison right now,
Wait, are
or
you
under
saying it's $44,000 per prisoner?
per prisoner. And that's if they don't have any special health needs, if they're not elderly, if they're not in a hospice, if they're not in medical. So that's just your average person. So you're talking a lot of money. So um, you figure if you just had 10 people in your community that came home and didn't go back to prison, look at the savings of money.
So everyone's
You know,
punished.
right.
Yeah, yeah. And I love the money argument because it does penetrate so much more of the population who, without judgment, there's no value judgment placed here, whether they are for humans or against them. They may not care about the people, they might actually believe in the punitive system. You tell them that the money that they're being taxed for is being thrown away on a system that is not working. That's like
Right.
telling somebody like you're going to go to the library but you can't check out any of the books, but you're still going to pay for the building. Thank you.
Exactly.
Doesn't
Yeah.
what? It doesn't make any sense. And so Maine, that's where you're at. You live and you
Right.
advocate in Maine. You said that the state's been far more progressive than other states in recent years. Can you kind of do a compare and contrast of Maine to other states, and then Maine's progress compared to just the nation as a whole? Because I want to know more about. We all hear a lot of talk about privatization, so I'm curious to see what part of the state governments and state run facilities are still, what role they're playing in all of this.
Okay, I am not aware of any of the private facilities. Anyone that's written to me has been in a state or federal run facility. So I don't know much about the private prisons except they're to make money. And they're not really for rehabilitation because if we rehabilitate the people, then people are going to be out of jobs. But one thing that I have found is I'm getting letters from across the country. I think I've 15 states so far. And so I have some people that I am in contact on a regular basis now. And one is in Baltimore, not Baltimore, Columbus, Maryland, at North Branch Prison. And that is a hyper supermax, which is one of the toughest prisons in the country.
Can you say that one more time? It's a what kind of prison?
A hyper supermax. So
Can you
it's
define that for me?
hyper super maximum security. So like they only move in certain sections. They only move 10 men at a time. So they're going to go out to wreck, go out in the yard. Usually they open up and the whole unit will go out 30, 40 men. Not there. They only allow 10 out at a time. And they have certain times that they're locked down a lot. So in Maine, there's a lot of freedom of movement, a lot of programming. Uh, in that particular facility, there's very little. I don't know if they have any educational programs at all in Maryland at that particular place. They do have religious services. Um, that's about the most that I'm aware of there. And the gentleman that I video visit with him and write to him and call. He calls also on the phone. He's Muslim, and there was a problem this past couple of weeks, right in the middle of Ramadan, and he wasn't allowed to participate in the rest of his services. So things like that bother me. Like religion is one of those things that is going to keep peace in the system. So keeping them in touch with their religious roots and cultural roots, I think is important. The other situation is death row. A lot of people don't think about that, but I have 9 men on death row at Central Prison in North Carolina that are writing and will start telling their stories very soon on my podcast, a second podcast that I do, which is Inside Death Row, North Carolina. They have been in a lockdown situation there for about 3 months. So what happens in lockdown is sometimes they don't come out of their cells at all. They're stuck in the cells 23 hours. They come out for an hour for rec, and I think they're allowed 2, maybe 3 showers a week. So with them, theirs is what they call an hour lockup. So on the top of the hour, the cells are open for 10 minutes, and they're allowed to either come out in the day room and stay out in the day room because the cell's going to get locked in 10 minutes, or they can come out and go back in and they're locked back in. And it's been like that for 3 months. And that means bag lunches, no going to chow. So that chances are it's peanut butter sandwich every day and a cup of oatmeal in the morning. Those guys, until a year ago, were allowed 1 phone call a year. 1. So when they got the tablets, they pretty much lost their minds. I mean, they couldn't believe it. And for some of these guys that I'm talking with have been in there 30 years. Can you imagine being on death row for 30 years? That is cruel and unusual punishment. It's bad enough we sentence people in this country to death. We allow our government to kill people. It's sanctioned by our government. And then we say, okay, but we're going to let you sit here for 30 years and every day worry when your number's coming up. I have guys that I have read their books. They've watched 15, 20, 25 people that they have known and lived with for years be walked to an execution chamber. This shouldn't happen in our country. I'm sorry.
Oh no, it's fine. My imagination
See,
is pretty strong. I care,
it's, and this is why I'm doing the work I'm doing. Your reaction right now is we live in a country that has gone crazy.
a
We
little
need
bit.
to start, we need to start really looking at everybody. And if we have 2 million people in prison, do they deserve to be there the rest of their lives with no opportunities ever again? Even the people on death row, this sounds crazy, but I have learned so much from these men on death row. It's like going back to school. To see the compassion that they have for each other and the way that they talk about each other and the camaraderie and support. One of the men's moms had passed away, and all these guys got together and went to them and said, they were their family. That's all they had. My passion with death row happened because back in the early 90s, Sister Helen Prejean was really, I don't want to say screaming, but kind of screaming about the idea that DNA was coming out and there was innocent people being put to death. And we've had 120 people released. Well, it's more than that now. When I did my research, it was 120 people that had been released because they weren't guilty. You cannot bring someone back after you've executed them.
No, and I'm sure the attempt has been made not to bring anybody back, but to definitely cover up the problem. I know that the Georgia Justice Project, that's something that they're very much focused on. Everyone, I'm sure, has heard of the Innocence Project. It is, and I'll bleep myself out later, but it is up how many people are innocent. What? What? And there are so many attempts. It is such a strong urge for governors and state officials to be like, no, 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 no. It couldn't be us. We couldn't have made that mistake. The law
Right.
enforcement got it right. And they'll fight and fight and fight and fight. And meanwhile, because the system's so slow, these innocent people everybody in the system, innocent or not, is waiting and waiting and waiting because it takes so long to get through these official, channels for decisions to be made. I'm curious if I were to ask someone who was the victim or on the receiving end of someone's crime, how they would, if they feel that putting someone in that situation for 30 years, never knowing when their number was going to come up, if they thought that was the right type of approach to healing and fixing and trying to follow with forgiveness. I just don't see, I don't think human beings are like that. Some might be. Okay, I'll give you the pot of people who are like, screw them, like let them suffer. But
Yeah.
no, I don't think they talk a lot. Why? Like I don't understand the mindset behind that. Maybe you have a better insight of the mindset of people who are making the decisions for others.
Well, I think that they've never had the personal experience. You know, a lot of our people that are making our decisions about what happens to you and I are people who come from very affluent families. They come from money. A lot of your politicians come from money. Not all of them, poverty hits everybody, but so if you've never lived that experience, if you are making decisions about jails and prisons and human beings that are living there, shouldn't you have to go into one of them? You know, how many of our politicians have ever walked into a jail?
I wonder.
And
Probably not a
I, and
lot.
especially a place like, the supermaxes, like the Maine State Prison, it's where, they say the worst of the worst, and that's the thing is, I would hate to be judged for my worst mistake that I made in my life for the rest of my life. And the whole thing about punishment, you were saying about people want to be punitive. Well, the punishment is going to prison. It's not to make them suffer once they get there. So the punishment is everything that's normal to them is gone. Their family is gone, their home is gone, their job is gone, their clothing, they wear the same thing everyone else wears. They have no choice in their foods other than what they get out of commissary. It's the same thing every day, over and over again, for year after year. It has to change.